My Uncle Trent died last week. Official cause of death was cirrhosis. He had been 75 years old. Quite frankly, he had made it much longer than any of us had been expecting. I know how callous that sounds, but it is what it is. Guy never put down the bottle. I had been really young at the time, but from what my dad told me, Trent had been a perfectly happy guy up until the day he left for Vietnam. He'd had a lot of friends, had been popular with women, maintained good relationships with family, had a degree in civil engineering. Such a far cry from the person that had come back that we almost wanted to question whether or not he'd been replaced. After he returned to the US, he decided to just stop participating in life. A spiritual side of sorts. He broke up with his girlfriend, never applied to any jobs, never reached out to friends or family, never had any hobbies or seemed to do anything at all. He rented a small studio apartment on the edge of town and just stayed in there, drinking and smoking the days away. It was a mystery how he always seemed to have enough money to cover his expenses. For a while, I just assumed that either my father or grandfather had been subsidizing him from afar. But I would later learn that wasn't the case. Never had he asked them for money. Even when they'd offer some to him with no strings attached, he had refused, told them he didn't need it. I tried to visit him every now and then, but my motivation to do so really dwindled near the end. I'd like to think it wasn't because I was a terrible nephew or anything. It was just hard to talk to the guy. Hard to deal with him. After every visit, I would walk away with this terrible taste in my mouth, and it wasn't just from breathing in the booze fumes and cigarette smoke. He never seemed willing to reciprocate any sort of conversation, never said more than a few words at a time. He'd always just stare ahead at the television, and I couldn't tell if he were actually paying attention to what was happening on the screen or if he were just dissociating. There were moments where it almost seemed like he wanted to tell me something. He'd look away from the screen and stare at me with this tortured expression, as if he desperately wanted to get something off his chest, but just couldn't bring himself to do it. He'd open his mouth as if ready to speak, and then nothing. Always nothing. So you can imagine how shocked I was when I got a call from my mother telling me that Trent wanted to see me, that he wanted to talk to me about something. I'm sure my dad would have been the one to tell me, but he had passed from cancer a few years back. At first, I wasn't so sure how I felt about the idea. After all these years, all of my efforts to try and get through to him, and now he finally wanted to talk? I wanted to be more than pissed off than I actually was. But in truth, I still had some grace left to spare the guy. Maybe he'd realized that his time left on Earth was short and regretted pushing so many people away. Perhaps this was an attempt at some kind of closure. At the same time, I couldn't deny how curious I was. Maybe he'd finally tell me what happened over there. Though I wasn't totally convinced that I wanted to know. I drove over to his apartment and knocked on his door. I heard him coughing inside before telling me that the door was unlocked, to come right in. My first time entering the place in over a decade, and it smelled and looked so much worse than I had remembered. A sense of heavy despair floating around in the air. Trent was sitting on the same couch he always had, though now it looked like it belonged in a landfill. Cracks in the paint, stains all over. Spread out across the old coffee table in front of him were several beer cans, liquor bottles, cigarette butts. The smell of mold and rot was nearly overpowering the smoke. He turned around, and it's hard to understate the dread I felt looking at his face. Hard to see him in such a state. Made me feel like an asshole for not doing more to help. But I had tried. A lot of us had. I walked over and sat down on the couch beside him. I asked him how he was feeling. He shook his head, told me not to bother, that I didn't need to pretend, that he was sick but not senile, that he was well aware of the costs of his behavior over the last 50 or so years and didn't blame any of us for no longer wanting to deal with him. But it wasn't an accident. It had been a very calculated decision. Hearing him say all this caught me off guard. From what I could recall, this was the longest conversation we'd ever had, and even more surprising was how lucid he seemed. I thought that decades of alcohol abuse would have taken more of a toll, But here he was, eyes and voice as earnest as anybody I'd seen before. I told him that I had no doubts he had experienced things more terrible than I could have imagined, but he never had to deal with it alone. We had been there for him, so why had he chosen a life of solitude? And this is where the conversation took a strange turn. Trent took a long exhale and looked around the apartment. Then he said it was because he never wanted to put any of us in danger. I stared at him, asked what he meant by that. What kind of danger? He told me he wasn't exactly sure, which was why it scared him so much. He claimed that if he were to tell me what had happened to him, I needed to be ready to deal with the consequences. That once I was privy to such knowledge, it would complicate my life in ways that would be hard to deal with, that I'd likely be forced to look over my shoulder for the rest of my years. But if I was prepared to take that risk, then I should pour myself some whiskey and get ready to listen. Hearing him say these things made my heart drop. Not because I believed them, but because it all but confirmed his deteriorating state of mind. Articulate as he still was, he was clearly no longer there. I decided to humor him. I smiled, told him that I was willing to take the risk. But once the words left my mouth, I could see his expression sour. "You don't believe me," he said. "You think these are the ramblings of a man gone wild." I didn't expect the immediate pushback. I didn't know what to say, and so I began stumbling over my words, searching for an answer. "I don't blame you," he continued. "I don't. I know I'm near the end. I know my mind's nearly gone. But this is something that even in death I'll never forget. You want to know why I drink? It's because if I don't, then it's all I can think about. All I can dream about." He paused and lit up a cigarette and took several long drags before staring at me. "Knowledge can be a burden. If you're going to hear this, then I need to know that you believe me, that you've accepted the risk. Otherwise, we can just forget about it. You can go on and live your life with no worries." I still wasn't sure what to think, but my curiosity had started to burn. I asked him why he even wanted to tell me about it. If it was so dangerous, then why didn't he just keep it to himself? He said that he didn't have a good answer to that. He just felt like somebody needed to know what had happened before it died with him. He said that there exists a darkness in this world that's beyond anything we've been taught, anything we were familiar with, anything we had the ability to understand. And one day, we might have to deal with it. It was the spring of 1967. He was in the Central Highlands, part of a platoon of about 30, trekking through deep jungle. Their objective had been to make contact with a French intelligence officer named Bernier, who would then guide them to a sizable NVA camp that they were meant to ambush and subsequently commandeer. Simple directives, but to actually execute them without dying or getting maimed would have been some Herculean feat. At that point, he'd already witnessed 23 others face a variety of gruesome ends. He remembered that exact number because each one had been burned so deep into his psyche that it was hard not to keep a tally. Every moment spent in the jungle put him on edge. He was always paranoid, tired, scared. He said it had to be some version of hell. That particular day, the air had been hot and thick, a heavy sun blazing above. Mosquitoes were constantly swarming around their heads, while ants were constantly crawling up their boots. His arms were heavy from hacking away bamboo and large rattan vines. He could smell moss, earth, sharp and acrid odors from wildlife, sweat and gun oil from wafting off of his fellow draftees. His feet ached, hot and wet in his boots. Trench foot had become a common issue, and he feared it would reach him soon. They had been walking for a long time. How long exactly, he couldn't tell for sure, but he said it had felt longer than anything he'd ever done before. When night came, they slept on the ground, covering themselves with thin poncho liners. Of course, sleep didn't come, for any of them. As he laid on the soil, he could hear no snoring. He could hear nothing at all. Nothing. You could have heard a pin drop, which was unusual, so much so that he sat up the moment he realized this. Soon, most everybody else was awake as well. He looked around in the darkness, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be looking for. But he could feel the hairs standing tall on the back of his neck, as if it were meant to be a signal that they were in the presence of something dangerous. They turned their flashlights on, and the soldiers stared between each other, as if their fellow man might have an answer for this strange thing they were all feeling. Before long, something shattered the silence. They all grabbed their rifles and stood, though none could make sense of the noise. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere above them. They looked up, and eventually one of their lights caught movement. Something crawling down one of the trees. He said that it felt like his brain was short-circuiting when it tried processing what he was seeing. It was a human figure, crawling on all fours down the trunk. That wasn't right. That couldn't be right. They weren't able to get a good look at the creature/person before it leapt onto a different tree, and then another. Soon it was bouncing between the trees at an unnervingly fast pace, and it wasn't much longer before the first shot was fired. Chaos erupted as erratic streams of gunfire cracked through the night. There was a lot of screaming, a lot of scrambling. They were dealing with just a singular target, but one that seemed impossible to hit. At one point, the figure had jumped onto the tree directly behind Trent. He turned around, shining his light on what looked to be a pale, naked, emaciated man. His eyes were sunken in, the skin on his face stretched tight across the skull. He had bushy eyebrows and thick, dark hair, hanging off of a branch with one arm like a primate. He was staring directly at Trent and smiling. His teeth were large, terribly rotten, small worms wriggling around between them. He said that his face was no further than a few feet away from his own, and he could see it so clearly that the image was instantly burned into his head, something incapable of being forgotten. He fumbled for his rifle, but by the time he had it steady in his hands, the man had leapt away into the darkness. A piercing foul stench lingered in the air, something like sour milk mixed with a strange industrial element. It was so intense that it made him tear up. The entire platoon stayed awake for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, they marched on deeper into the jungle. The morning was spent moving in silence. Nobody quite knew what to say, but after a while, somebody suggested that they hit back. It was a request that was shut down fairly quick by Gutierrez, their platoon leader, real hard-nosed guy. He said they had a job to do, that they were obligated by national duty to see it through no matter what, but he didn't sound so sure about it. His words lacked conviction, as if he had tried but failed to convince himself that he wasn't confused and terrified. They moved on. Trent said that the sun seemed brighter that day, a cloudless sky above. The boiling temperatures coupled with the sleep deprivation proved to be one hell of a thing. At around noon, they came across 2 corpses sprawled out on the ground, NVA soldiers, and the only reason they were able to figure this out was due to the SKS carbines laid out beside them. The actual bodies were indistinguishable, mutilated to a degree where they hardly resembled people at all. Dozens of chunks of flesh had been torn away. Several limbs were missing, as if they had been ripped straight off. They were ready to believe that it could have been a work of a tiger or a wild boar, until they saw a third body dangling by its entrails from one of the tree branches about 50 feet above. Still, Gutierrez insisted that it was just that, an animal. That the thing from the night before had also been an animal. That there was nothing weird going on and they had nothing to worry about. A few soldiers out of the platoon seemed ready to accept this, but the larger majority weren't. Somebody suggested that they abort the mission. Several more concurred. Gutierrez pushed back, claiming that they were closer to meeting up with Bernier than they were to the barracks, so they may as well continue on. A lot of arguing ensued. Emotions flared. Things got heated. Ultimately, they had a vote. 7 of them wanted to turn back, while the rest thought it better to press on. Those 7 ended up going back on their own. Trent had admitted that he had considered going with them, until he considered the logistics of it. They had no chance of making it back before nightfall. Better to go with strength in numbers. By the time the sun had started to set again, the tension in the air was almost palpable. He said that his legs felt heavy and the blisters on his feet had started to open, but he pressed forward, doing his best to keep up with the group. At some point, somebody walked up next to him. He introduced himself as Duncan and then asked whether or not he'd seen it. Trent asked him what that was supposed to mean. Seen what? The man that had been jumping between the trees, Duncan told him. He wanted to know whether or not Trent had gotten a good look at his face. Trent nodded, told him that he had. Duncan then asked them to describe their appearance. As Trent did so, his face went pale. He told them that he'd seen what looked to be the same man around 10 minutes ago. He had been crouched down in the brush a few dozen feet behind the group, just staring at them as they walked. Duncan was about to shout at him when he suddenly disappeared, sinking into the ground. Those were the precise words he'd used, sunk straight down into the dirt. They mentioned this to Gutierrez, but he brushed them off, told them to keep moving and to keep staying alert. But his eyes contradicted his words. They could see the fear in them, the disbelief, the panic he was trying desperately to suppress. An uncomfortable feeling spread amongst them as the sky began to darken, because they should have already made contact with Bernier several hours ago. Gutierrez tried to rationalize this by claiming that they had been moving too slow, that in order to make up for their lack of pace, they needed to press forward through the night, no setting up camp. And this is where things started to boil over. The rest of the platoon told him there was no way in hell that was happening. They were well over 40 hours without sleep in this blasted jungle, and their bodies were ready to collapse. They needed to rest. But Gutierrez wasn't so convinced. He told them that they could set up camp if they wanted to, but that he'd go ahead and make contact with Bernier himself. They tried explaining to him how bad of an idea that was, but he was too stubborn, too delirious to be placated. He ended up marching forward into the darkness alone. Nobody else joined him. They began setting up for the night, and Trent volunteered to be part of the first night shift watch. Not because he wasn't tired. He certainly was. He said it felt like his eyeballs had been left out to dry for a week in the sun. But he also knew that as long as he was out in the jungle, he wasn't getting a lick of sleep. Not after everything that had happened. The first hour or so was uneventful. He just sat there looking up at the stars and listening to the near-deafening droning of the crickets, cicadas, whatever else was out there. He said that it managed to somewhat put him at ease, because the bugs were part of the natural environment. This is where they belonged. But the peace didn't last much longer. Soon, the silence had returned. He said it was like a switch had been flipped. He couldn't explain it. In fact, there seemed to be no possible explanation at all. Even though there was no explicit threat, they all grabbed their rifles, though they kept their lights off. Not because anybody had ordered them to do so. It just happened to be a decision they all collectively arrived at, as if turning them on might expose them to whatever the hell was out there. But nothing happened. The silence persisted, and they were left in limbo, fingers itching their triggers, but without a target to aim for. Eventually, somebody pointed out something strange. A hole in the ground in front of them. The stars were bright enough that they didn't need to ask what he was talking about. They could all see it without issue. And it was just that. A hole in the ground. It was a perfect, pitch-black circle about the size of a manhole cover. They all just stared at it. Trent said he was really tempted to start shooting. But at what? What was supposed to happen here? Suddenly, something came flying out of it. As if somebody had been standing down in the hole and tossed it up. It was a body, horrifically mangled like the others. They looked back at the hole and saw it had disappeared. Then they looked back at the body. Despite the extent to which it had been mutilated, they were still able to tell exactly who it was. Gutierrez. They had been around him long enough for their brains to be able to fill in the missing details. It looked like the entire left side of his face had been brutally cleaved off, though they couldn't be sure what exactly had done it. Maybe a large set of teeth, maybe a saw. He had one eye that remained intact, and it was stuck wide open, frozen in a perpetual look of terror. Trent had been hoping that the sleep deprivation had caused him to start hallucinating, but to his disbelief, everybody else confirmed that they were seeing the same thing, that Gutierrez's body had actually been tossed up from a hole in the ground. A hole that was now no longer there. He said that he didn't remember falling asleep that night, but that he must have done so at some point, because he remembered waking up in the daylight to the sound of something sizzling, the smell of meat, garlic, and onions. He sat up, rubbed his eyes. He stared ahead and saw a man crouched over a makeshift fire pit just a few feet away from where they had been laying, using a stick to push around what looked like cubed slices of meat in a frying pan. He was wearing a windbreaker, cargo pants, boots. He wasn't carrying a weapon. Soon, the rest of the platoon was awake as well, but nobody said a word. They all just stared at the guy as if doing anything to catch his attention may end up proving dangerous. Eventually, the man put the stick down and turned to face them. Trent told me that the moment he saw his face, he had to swallow down the bile that was shooting up his throat. He appeared to be around 6'6", but deathly frail at the same time, to the point where it looked like a strong wind may cause him to sway. His skin was the shade of paper and pulled so tight against his skull that it almost looked like a mask. Everything about him was wrong, like some strange attempt to replicate a human, but one that hadn't gone quite right. It was the same guy from the other night. He said there was no mistaking it. The man stared at him for a while, before smiling, revealing a set of sewage-colored teeth. A familiar stench came wafting through the air. Trent locked eyes with Duncan. He looked petrified. The man introduced himself as Bernier. He said it was nice to finally meet everyone. Nobody responded to him, and nobody moved. There came an uncomfortably long stretch of silence that was broken only when Bernier asked if anybody was hungry. Trent said they were surely all starving, but none said a word. They still hadn't overcome the initial shock. He looked around for Gutierrez's body, but it was no longer there. The man insisted that they try some of the beef that he'd cooked up, that they'd need the energy for the long trek ahead. Despite his strange appearance, the man's voice was normal enough, but his accent wasn't French. They couldn't tell exactly what it was. The man then reached behind his back and pulled out a large bottle of water. He must have grabbed it out of thin air because he wasn't carrying a rucksack, wasn't carrying anything at all. Trent stared closely at the bottle and saw pieces of ice floating around in it, despite it being close to 90 degrees out. The man held it forward, asked if anybody was thirsty. Trent said his throat felt like sandpaper, but he said nothing. The man just kept holding it out, continuing to ask if anybody needed a drink. Eventually, somebody walked forward, seemingly ready to accept the offer. But Trent stepped in front of him, told him not to. He said he wasn't sure where the sudden audacity had come from, that it was more of a visceral reaction. A primal need to protect his fellow man from danger. He said he was 100% certain it wasn't water in that bottle. The soldier looked confused, but didn't seem willing to fight him on it. He backed away. Suddenly, the man's smile dropped, and he turned to look at Trent. He said to me that he had never seen such an expression of hatred before, that there was a kind of cruelty behind the eyes that seemed to transcend reality. But it lingered for only a few seconds before the smile returned. Trent said that he thought he could see some kind of worm trying to squirm out of his mouth through a gap in his teeth. The man placed the bottle on the ground and said it was there for anybody to take, but that they better get a move on, because they had a long trek ahead. He took a few steps to the side as if to make way for one of them to take the lead. Behind them was a path that Trent hadn't noticed before. A clean break in the vegetation. Way too clean. It looked unnatural, made even more so by the fact that it was too dark to see into, as if the space were swallowing every trace of sunlight. Once again, the man told them that they better start moving, that they had a long trek ahead. But nobody moved. At that point, every man in the platoon had come to an unspoken understanding that before them stood an utterly evil presence, that under no circumstances could they give him what he wanted. So they just stared at him, unsure of how else to proceed. The man stared back at them, and they could see a smile slowly fading. He began repeating himself, the agitation escalating in his voice with each iteration. Better start moving. Long trek ahead. As if that were one of the few phrases he knew how to say. They didn't know what to do. They were all too terrified and bewildered by the man to try and confront him. So they just stood there watching him. After what felt like an hour, they could hear the whirring of helicopter blades in the distance, heading their direction. Trent said that the relief he felt upon hearing it was nearly euphoric. The man looked up at the sky and then back down at them. Now, that hateful expression had returned. He clenched his jaw tight, and Trent was nearly convinced that he was priming himself to leap at them. But then he turned, walked into the darkness of the path. Trent blinked, and the man was gone, and so was the path, just gone in an instant, as if they had both never been there. They might have been able to rationalize the whole thing as some mass hallucination caused by some kind of experimental gas that was being tested on them. But the frying pan and the bottle was still there. The fire was still going. The meat now burned to blackened scraps. Just a few minutes later, they watched as several helicopters descended down into a nearby clearing. Shortly after, they were all extracted back to base. Of course, they had a lot of questions, but no matter how many they asked, they weren't getting any answers back. They were simply told to sit in the barracks and wait. But for what? What the hell had just happened? After a while, each member of the platoon was questioned individually by men in suits. CIA agents, he assumed, though he couldn't confirm this. Trent said that describing what had happened out loud made him want to question whether or not any of it was real. It all just seemed so absurd, but the suits didn't seem to think so. They listened intently to everything he had to say. Nothing in their tones, expressions, or language suggested that they were incredulous about any of it, which freaked them out even more. At one point, he asked them point blank who the hell this man was. The suits told him that they didn't know, that they'd never been able to find out. The next day, they were all put on a flight back to the US. They were simply told that they had satisfied their obligations, that their tour of duty was officially over. But they knew this wasn't true, because the standard length of a tour was 12 months, and they hadn't even been there for 8. But nobody questioned it. They were all just happy to get the hell out of there. Trent took a taxi home from the airport. Once it pulled up to his building, he saw another suit standing in front of his door. The guy flashed him a CIA badge and introduced himself as Miller. Then he asked if they could go inside and have a quick chat. Trent said that the guy didn't seem threatening or anything, but that there was a strange energy coming off of him, something that he couldn't quite wrap his head around. Once they were up in his unit, Miller opened the briefcase he'd been carrying and took out a large stack of papers. Trent told him that if he expected him to read through all of that, he was out of his mind. Miller laughed, told him that this was just a consequence of bureaucracy, but that he'd go ahead and quickly summarize everything he needed to know. The government was going to pay him $6,000, which would have inflated to about $55,000 today in benefits per year for the rest of his life. These benefits would be adjusted for inflation as long as he remained alive. The only condition was that he could never talk about what he'd seen in Vietnam. Absolutely no mention of the man to anybody. The second that he did so, they'd cut him off. All he needed to do was sign. Trent said that he tried squeezing some more information out of Miller, but the guy was stone-like. He wouldn't budge. He'd asked him what would happen if he didn't sign it. Maybe he wanted to tell the world exactly what he'd seen. Maybe it'd make him famous and he'd be able to make a career out of it. In response, Miller told him that they could raise that number to $7,500 a year. Trent asked them what they were so afraid of. Why didn't they want this information out there? Miller told him that wasn't his concern, but that if he were dying for some kind of answer and couldn't deal with not having one, that he'd go ahead and put it succinctly. There were certain things that the public were better off not knowing. It'd be easier for them. It would introduce less chaos and allow society to run as smoothly as possible. It wasn't that they were purposefully trying to keep civilians in the dark. They were just trying to protect them. By the end of their conversation, Trent had managed to get him up to $11,000. He still hadn't fully accepted what Miller was trying to tell him. He'd gone back and forth with him for nearly half an hour, but he was tired. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. He didn't want to think about it. The silver lining was that he wouldn't be homeless anytime soon, because there was no way he would have been able to go to work after this. At least, not for a long while. He tried to focus on the positives. Now, he had free time to do what he pleased. He could travel the world. He could start a business. But for the next few weeks, he did nothing at all. Because he couldn't stop thinking about the man. It was all he could focus on. He found a way around it through liquor. He drank at every meal. Then he was drinking between meals. And then every hour, on the hour from noon to midnight. And it was working. He was out partying so much that he wasn't thinking about it anymore. One day, he was feeling generous and offered to fly my dad out to Hawaii. They'd lay on the beach, drink until they puked, etc. For the first few days, they were having a great time. It was paradise. And then one evening, they were laying on the beach. The sky was starting to turn a beautiful shade of orange. About 80 degrees, the cool wind starting to prickle the sweat on their skin. As it got darker, the beach slowly began to empty out. They had nowhere else to be, so they stayed, waited for the sunset. He'd become buzzed enough that he began to tell my dad about everything that had happened. He said that keeping it pent up inside was starting to kill him. He had to let it out. He had to tell somebody. And if there was anybody he could trust, it would have been my dad. But he didn't get far with it, stopping right before he could describe the first encounter. Because that's when he noticed the figure out in the water. Everybody else left, but this person remained, standing about knee-deep in the ocean, just standing there. The figure appeared to be tall, lanky. Trent said it looked like they were wearing pants and a jacket, though they were a bit too far for him to make out any more details beyond that. But it was freaking him out, because what the hell were they doing? He leaned forward and squinted ahead until he was able to make out what they looked like. The realization washed over him like a cold wave. He stood up and told my dad that they needed to leave, that he ran all the way back to the hotel room and drank until he passed out. He told me it had been the same man from the jungle, wearing the same clothes. When I asked him how he could be so sure of that, he told me it was unmistakable, that it was a face he'd never forget. Afterwards, he had reached out to other members of the platoon. The few that rode him back told him that they'd also seen the man since coming back. One of them had even seen him all the way out in Italy, and in each instance, they had been on the cusp of divulging the details of what happened in the jungle to somebody else, as if the man had somehow preempted their thoughts and showed up before they could. Then he began hearing some stranger things through the grapevine, like how the bodies of the 7 soldiers that had turned back had been found a week later. They had all been smashed together into a mound of rotting flesh that had been gruesomely stuffed into a foxhole. He also heard that the government had done a deep dive into Bernier's background, along with correspondence that had taken place between them months earlier. They had found weird inconsistencies Things that just didn't add up. Like the fact that the French military contacts they thought they had been talking to didn't actually exist. That every name and rank had been fabricated, but that it had been done so well, they just hadn't caught it until much later. But now, the French were denying Bernier's existence outright. He had never been an officer, never been a part of the military. They couldn't confirm records of any schooling, or who his parents were, or if he was even born on French soil. But then, he also heard reports about a man fitting Bernier's physical description who had escaped from a prison in Egypt a few years earlier. It was a notable enough event because there weren't many people in Egypt who looked like him, and escaping from a prison over there was next to impossible. He heard some other stuff as well, but at some point, it all just became too much. Trying to process it all was starting to drive him mad. No matter where he went, he couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder. Soon, he had stopped going anywhere at all, save for the bar down the street, and he sure as hell never talked about Vietnam again. Until now. And that was it. That was his story. He hoped it had managed to shed some light on things, mainly that isolating himself hadn't been a personal thing. He said he hoped that I understood, and that he still appreciated the efforts I made to try and talk to him. And then he told me he was sorry, that I was now in danger. I asked him how he could be so sure. Maybe after all these years, the man was gone. Maybe he'd died, or maybe he'd just moved on. Trent said he knew that wasn't the case, because he could see the man right now. He was staring at us through the window. I turned to look at the window, and for a split second, I could see what appeared to be somebody's head peeking up at us near the bottom of the glass. But then I blinked, and they were gone. Trent lived on the 7th floor. I called the cops despite Trent telling me not to. They searched the area, but couldn't find anything. They told me that maybe it had just been a trick of the light, but to call again if I saw anything else. I didn't feel comfortable leaving Trent alone for the night, so I told him that I'd sleep in the guest room. He protested against it, told me there was no need, but I insisted, because I could see the fear in his eyes. He was terrified. Of course, I didn't get any sleep that night, but the sun came up and I never heard anything strange. When I tried to wake up Trent the next morning, I wasn't able to. There was a cool breeze in the room, and I noticed that the window was open. I sure as hell hadn't left it open, and I doubt that Trent would have opened it. I called an ambulance and they took him away. Later I learned that he was pronounced dead at the hospital. Sudden acute liver failure. A sensible enough explanation. But the circumstances just didn't sit right with me. The funeral was only a week later. A really quick, impromptu venue. There weren't many who showed up. Other than my mom, my sister, and myself, there were some estranged relatives, a few of his drinking buddies. And then, one other man that nobody else seemed to recognize. He was wearing an old windbreaker jacket and cargo pants that seemed too baggy for his frame. Although he was sitting down, I could tell that he was quite tall. His skin was pale, his features bizarre and uncanny enough that I couldn't help but stare. What freaked me out even more was that I never actually remembered seeing him show up. It's like he just suddenly appeared. For a while, I thought I might have been hallucinating the guy, until my sister made a remark about how much he was freaking her out. It was an open casket funeral, and the moment they brought Trent's body out, the man was gone. I didn't see him leaving either. Ever since the funeral, strange things have been happening. It feels like I'm being followed. I'm seeing the same black SUV parked wherever I go. One time, I looked through the peephole of my apartment in the middle of the night and caught somebody in a suit standing outside my door. Not the same man from the funeral, although I've been seeing him as well, walking behind me in public, stalking me around grocery stores, sitting a few tables over in cafes and restaurants. I don't know what the fuck he wants from me. I don't know what to do about him. But now I understand what Trent had meant. that knowledge isn't always a good thing. That sometimes it can be dangerous.